Okay, do you recall the discussion we had in one of the about the A-380? The A-380 was the world's largest passenger jet. Pardon? What? The double-decker, yeah, you're right, Ann. The double-decker. Oh, no, what's wrong with that one? Let's see. Well, today we're going to talk about what happened to it, the history of the A-380. And I got to tell you in advance, it is not a pleasant history. It probably won't bankrupt Airbus Industries, but it will have cost them huge amounts of money because just to develop the A380 cost them $50 billion. One aircraft to develop it. One of the problems that Airbus had is that in the beginning it was composed of 4 major partners but 16 different companies scattered throughout France and Germany. Originally, we talked about Airbus being a combination of French and the British, but the British bowed out fairly early on, but they allowed Hawker Siddeley to stay in because Hawker Siddeley were manufacturing the wings, and it was such a crucial part of the manufacturing process that even though England bowed out of the consortium of Airbus, they let Hawker Siddeley stay in at a 20% representation. So these 4 partners represent 16 different manufacturing facilities located in Western Europe, all the way from Spain to Italy to the Eastern Bloc countries. And that is one of the beginning problems that Airbus experienced. Too many people, too much variability between and among those 16 companies. Everybody ready? Jacob.
What does the Air Force One fly in? Like, is it Airbus? Or?
They fly the Boeing 747. There would be chaos in Congress if the federal government ever used a foreign manufacturer for Air Force One. In fact, when Airbus won the original competition for the Air Force tankers, there was that same revolt in Congress, and they had to completely redo the program. And of course, who won? An American company finally won the contract for, Boeing won it for the Air Force tankers. They're going to use a 767 tanker rather than the old Boeing 707. Okay. From here on, for the next few slides, relax, because it's a review of what we went through before. But I want to bring your attention one more time to what the Airbus looked like both inside and out. This is just a cutaway view of the Airbus. I just can't even imagine sitting in a row of seats that's like 11 or 12 across. That to me would be, I'd be sitting here thinking this is a movie theater taking off. Right? I don't know what the width is. That's in the specifications, and I didn't bother to put that up here because I didn't want to bother you people with that kind of detail. But that kind of detail is available for you to understand. But it's got to be what? At least 20-some feet, right? 3 times 10 is 30 feet. So if it's 2 feet wide, That's 20 feet, plus aisles. Pardon? Okay, so here's the cockpit of the A380, and as you can tell, and you remember that it doesn't have a... One of the differences that has caused Airbus to not have a real good accident rate with regard to their other airplanes. Here's a look at the interior of one of the business classes. I think it's probably Emirates Airline, because Emirates Airline is the biggest user of the A380s. They have more aircraft than anybody, and in fact, they could be the one airline that would save Airbus from going bankrupt. They don't necessarily want to take any more A380s, but so many airlines have opted out that it may be falling to them to save Airbus. Here's a stairway to the upper deck. One of the things about it is that the wing and the engines on the wing are so heavy that, contrary to most airliners, their wing actually hangs down like that when it's on the ground. Now, as it takes off and the wing generates lift, the wing bends up. But not nearly as much as, for example, the 787. Remember the picture of the 787 where the wing bent way up in flight? That's because of composites with the 787. And here it is taxiing, and here it is landing. So how do I know that's landing as opposed to taking off? Smoke, right? Smoke from the tires. Okay, there are large differences you've found before. This is really a review of what you had before, where we talked about Boeing versus Airbus. I forget what lecture number it was, but it was one of the differences between the two. There were comparison of cockpit controls. We did that before. One is clearly side stick controllers, and the other is a wheel on a stick. And if you go back to your notes on Airbus versus Boeing, you'll actually have this the exact same lecture. Remember, Boeing relies on the pilot, Airbus relies on the computer. I'm sure Airbus would wildly disagree with me for that statement, but if you look at it, Daniel, let's go. Pardon?
Cyber attack? Cyber attack on the airplane?
A what?
Like cyber attack?
Cyber attack?
To the airplane?
You're asking whether there ever was one? Oh, sure. It can happen on any aircraft, right? I mean, if you can get past the security and get on board an aircraft, whatever aircraft you're on, but it never had a terrorist attack on the A380. Eric? Pardon? The A380 is computer operated mainly, right? Yes, they can override it, and if you were a pilot and somebody was holding a gun to your head and said, override the computer for me, probably you would do it, right? Well, you guys all planning to be terrorists or what? All right, are the pilots computer operators? Yes. Because from about 1,000 feet after takeoff, they punch the button on the computer, and the aircraft is flown by computer for the entire route. Why don't the Airbus crew members work together? Because the two side stick controllers are not connected to one another. But the Boeing wheel and stick, both are connected. so that when somebody on the right side of the aircraft, the first officer pulls that wheel back, the wheel on the captain's side gets pulled back as well. That was a major difference in the accident over the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Brazil with an Airbus A380. Okay, we looked this over. There was actually a quiz on this. The aircraft are similar. The Boeing 707 uses 50% composites. That was one of the questions on the quiz. Side stick controls used on the Airbus. The control stick used on all Boeing aircraft. Boeing has command of marketing projections. And you'll see that a little bit better now when we talk about what has A380. It's kind of sad because it's really a remarkable design for an aircraft, but it was completely at the wrong time. And as I said before, they made a serious mistake with the 380. Andrew? I don't think so, but who knows? Because the only answer that can come would be in 20 years from now to see whether a huge aircraft that could carry as many as 835 passengers could ever be viable in the world. I don't think so, but... Okay, here we go now. This is the brand new lecture. Andrew? Pardon? Yes, I can. What I like about the fact that you asked me to go back, it tells me that you are serious and conscientious about creating good notes. So thank you for doing that. Everybody okay? Okay, troubles in France and Germany and elsewhere. So what happened when England got out of the consortium, Germany and France were the only two major countries involved. There were other countries, Spain, Portugal, Italy, other countries like that, but the two main countries were France and Germany. So let's look at what some of those troubles were. These titles will be repeated as I go through the lecture, so you don't actually have to write them down. So what happened right off the bat as they began production in 2002? So keep that in mind. They started in 2002, and that will show up in the lecture. They had three major delays that caused airlines either to cancel their orders or to demand delay payments. So Airbus had to come up with money, or they had to figure out what to do with those canceled orders. One of the other problems was there are 530 miles of wiring inside the airframe of the A380. And you'll see in a moment what that caused. There were very significant troubles among all the 16 different companies. Every company wanted to operate on its own. They didn't want to necessarily. So, for whatever parts they were building for Airbus, they would try to get the maximum amount of profit they could get, knowing that they were probably a sole source supplier of that particular part. For example, if one of the companies was building the tail, they were the only company building the tail. So in building the tail and selling it to Airbus, they tried to get as much money as they could possibly get from Airbus, knowing that there was nobody else that was going to produce the tail. So that was what happened with it. Significant competitive greed occurred among all 16 companies. And the other thing is, Airbus decided, almost on emotion, that they wanted to create a whole new era of super jumbo jets. And that's interesting because if you sit in a boardroom, and your whole motivation for spending $35 million on development of a new airplane, you certainly don't want to do it just because you want to start a new era of jumbo jets. The launch date was expected to be 2002. And manufacturing trouble surfaced in 2005. So now we've got 3 years after the launch date was expected. We still have troubles in 2005. French and Germans started disagreeing about a number of things. They started disagreeing about software, about hardware, about schedules, about almost anything you can think of. They were at odds with one another in the building of this massive aircraft. So as a result, deliveries were postponed until spring of 2006. One of the major problems occurred with the wiring harnesses. So you know that in an automobile or any sophisticated vehicle, they don't string the wires one by one. They build the wiring harnesses in a shop separately from the vehicle. So in the case of an aircraft, those wiring harnesses, they're called, where all the wires are put together in a bundle and they're distributed throughout the aircraft, they come to Airbus in a huge bundle ready to be bolted inside the airframe of the aircraft and ready to be attached to the different points. They don't string wires from the cockpit all the way back one by one. So a company somewhere is responsible for making these wiring harnesses. And you'll see that in automobiles as well. Even small aircraft today have harnesses. They don't string wires one by one. So what happened was Germany was using a slightly outdated version of the software necessary to create this bundle of wiring. France, on the other hand, got an updated version of the software program. And so when Germany supplied the harnesses, they would neither fit nor work inside the Airbus because of the difference in software. So nobody was responsible for saying, now wait a minute, Germany, you're building harnesses. Are you using the same software we are? All they had to do was compare the two versions of the software, and a 3-year delay would not have occurred. In this case, it postponed deliveries for 2 years. So that's really the answer. It's a 2-year delay because they had to completely redesign how the harnesses were going to fit inside the aircraft. So the cost of building, of getting into production and getting to the point where they could deliver an aircraft is $6 billion. Finally, in 2007, the first A-380 was delivered to Singapore Airlines. So Singapore, Qantas, and Emirates became the 3 major purchasers of the A-380. But short of that, in July of the previous year, the 2 heads of both companies, now EADS was the head of the consortium, so Airbus was one of the companies that was part of this overall. It's sort of like United Airlines being owned by UAL Corporation. United Airlines is the operating company. UAL is the sort of the investment holding company Well, EADS was the investment holding company of which Airbus was a part. And so in that year, 2006, both CEOs resigned because the project was so far off whatever they estimated. Then they chose a successor, and by October he resigned for Airbus. He claimed that the people in EADS were not allowing him the power and authority to reorganize Airbus, which is what he wanted to do and should have done, because it was the disorganization of Airbus and their 16 companies that caused so many troubles. So there was an article just recently. I'm bringing you up to current today in terms of where we are and what people think of what's going on with the A380. And Forbes magazine had an article called "The Death Watch Begins." That was in June of 2016. So that was only 2 years ago that Forbes was saying, there's going to be a big problem with this organization and that aircraft. In the meantime, the airlines are flying the A380, and they don't like what they see because the engines were not quite as powerful as they expected and not quite as efficient. So the airlines were putting tremendous pressure on Airbus to re-engine the aircraft, which means probably bigger, newer, more efficient engines. And of course, at that point in time, Airbus had spent so much money, they could not afford to go through the whole process, which would have taken a couple of years, of re-engineing the A380. Finally, the CEO of Airbus said, we have a problem. We're probably not going to be able to produce even as much as 20 aircraft a year, and that's in spite of the fact that they really had to produce 46 aircraft a year in order to break even. So here they were producing 20, or he said they're going to probably only produce 20. They needed to produce 46, and the latest estimate shows production to be only 8 next year. So from 46 break even down to 8 is the reality of what's been happening to Airbus. They say 30 for profitability. It really was 46. $30 billion now having been invested in the development of the 380. There are some magazines that report the fact that they think that number is low. They say between $35 and $50 billion it took to develop the A380. Want me to go back? Okay. So if you take a look at this scenario, ever since we started talking about the troubles in France, you quickly realize that if you were running a company, you'd either be tearing your hair out or you would have resigned, mainly because you yourself, as the chief executive officer of the company, didn't do a very good job of coordinating all of these suppliers. It's a massive failure of culture in the organization and communication. Culture, organization, and communication. That's what was missing at Airbus. Why? I think partly because they started off on a mission just to develop a new era in super jumbo jets. Not because they necessarily knew exactly what the market was going to do. In the meantime, Boeing said, hey, we're not going to go in that direction. We're going to go in the opposite direction. We're going to develop something smaller than the 777. And the 787 is smaller than the 777. So they went the opposite direction. Guess who won? Want me to go back? Pardon? Okay. I'll go back. I'm okay with that. That means you're making good notes. It's a real sad situation because I'm sure that everybody connected with Airbus really wanted to do a good job. Everybody wanted to succeed. Their A320 obviously is one of the most successful airliners ever built. Not compared to Boeing, because the 737 probably is by far more successful than the A320. But the A320 is a very, very good aircraft. The fact that it has side stick controllers that aren't connected, that's a big negative. But as far as price, delivery, orders, great aircraft. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. So here's the airline's view of the 380. Qantas, which had a number of them on order. Do you remember what Qantas stands for? It's a pardon? Osvaldo. That's correct. Everybody hear that? Queensland and Northern Territories. Those are two major blocks of Australia. There's the Northern Territories and Queensland. They're side by side, and the airline started flying people from one to the other, back and forth. It's like California, Nevada, but on a bigger scale. So they called themselves Queensland and Northern Territories Aerial Service, and that's how Qantas came to be. Thank you, Osvaldo. There were 10 other customers whose orders were canceled, but Airbus wouldn't disclose who they were. Somebody. Could have been an American Airlines, could have been it could have been United, who knows, Delta. Then Virgin Atlantic had an order for 6. They canceled that. Immediate is a leasing company, and in the airline industry, leasing companies are almost always the ones to buy huge quantities of aircraft that they then turn around and lease to the airlines. There's one called International Lease Corporation, ILC, that is a major player in buying aircraft and then turning around and leasing them to the airlines. So Immediate had 20 on order, canceled them all. Emirates Airline, the only one possible who maybe can accept more airplanes, but I read in the paper today that their profits are down, their load factor is down, their sales are down for the first time in 15 years. So it's unlikely that they're going to be a savior of Airbus. But Emirates decided that just in case, they would order 150 Boeing 777s. Now that's a hedge against Airbus not being able to continue to produce the A380. What a blow that was to Airbus. Can you imagine if you were the chief executive officer of Airbus and you just found out that Emirates had ordered 150, and even though the 777 is not a direct competitor to the A380, in terms of number of seats, it does have advantages. Number one, it has the same range as the 380, but only 25 fewer seats. And it has more cargo area than the A380. And finally, it has 2 fewer engines, that the engines themselves are even more modern than the ones on the 380. To re-engine because the older engines were not producing as much thrust, or not getting as much mileage, not getting as much efficiency out of the engines. So Emirates, being the world's largest buyer of the A380, decided to hedge their bet by ordering 150. Can you imagine 150 777s? That's a big, big number and a big fleet. And look what they get. They get an aircraft that's better, as much range, probably at least as fast or faster because it's not as bulky as the A380, with engines that are better, more efficient, better thrust. And then along comes Iran, and they ordered 100 aircraft from Airbus. Not a single one of them was the A380. And that hurt as well because Airbus thought maybe that out of an order of 100 aircraft, Iran Air would have at least ordered perhaps 10 or even 15 A380s. They ordered none. So you can see this big ball rolling downhill fast. You can almost feel that corporation just starting to go down faster. Daniel? If they don't sell any more, then they're going to do what? The newspapers have said, at least from what I've read, that it's going to be close, but they have been doing so well on the 320, the 350, and I don't remember what other aircraft, that probably they can stay alive. Again, they're going to have to be supported by the French and German governments, right? And then Boeing's going to raise heck because Boeing's going to say, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that. That's unfair competition. And then Airbus is going to come back. But Boeing, you get all kinds of revenue from the federal government because you produce military hardware. And then they fight back and forth all the time. Okay, what went wrong? I believe that when they decided to create a new era of super jumbo jets, I believe they made that emotionally and unnecessarily. Because if you know it's going to cost you $30 billion minimum to develop an aircraft, I sure wouldn't have done it on the basis of emotion. I would have done it on the basis of hundreds of thousands of pages of marketing data to describe the marketplace, to describe where it's going to be applicable, to describe how many places in the world could use a big aircraft like that. And they made a couple of other serious mistakes that we will cover here in a moment. Again, no real good marketing to rely on. Boeing's the master at that. They always have been. I think they always will, because the people who are in the marketing and sales department of Boeing are extremely loyal. They know what they're doing. They know the markets. They're out there all over the world listening to people, asking questions, understanding what the needs of the airlines are. And that's part of marketing, isn't it? Knowing your customer and knowing what they want and how they're going to use it. So there's no question in my mind, Boeing is the best marketing company by far. In addition to everything else that happened, early on in the history of the A380, they had three major engine problems. Now, to be fair to Airbus, not a single one of those engine problems resulted in any damage to the aircraft other than the engine. No lives were lost, no people were hurt, no aircraft were totaled. They just had serious engine problems. Either engines were blowing up or they were losing parts, like that. That's one of the engines. Can you imagine being a passenger and looking out and watching the cowling being torn off one of the engines? So, did that make the airlines nervous? You bet. And also passengers. I used to hear people say, I will never fly that aircraft. Because, the word gets around through all the media of the engine problems. And even though none of them resulted in an aircraft having to land under duress, because they have four engines, still, something like that, the word gets around like crazy, doesn't it? Especially with today's media, the social media. Can you imagine how fast that went on Facebook? Or whatever you use. I don't know what you use. It's something else. You guys will have to tell me. Every generation has something new. The only reason I'm on Facebook is because my friend Jack Wiegand, who went around the world, he quit doing email, and he said to me, Harold, the only way you can talk to me is by Facebook. And I said, I don't know anything about Facebook. I still don't, but I have a Facebook site. So one of the things they also did not do, again, Boeing does it, Airbus didn't do it, they underestimated how much it would cost an airline to just operate this thing. Not just fuel, but everything else connected with it, moving it around. Now you have to have bigger pieces of equipment to move it, right? Those ones that hook up to the nose wheel and push it back from the gate, or that pull it into the gate, that's an expense. All of the vehicle equipment around the aircraft all have to be changed. They have to help pay for all the gates they use. They have to pay for those passenger tunnels that go out to the airplane, because now it's so big, and now instead of just one tunnel or two, they need like 4 of them along the side of the aircraft. So, pardon? Was that something? Airlines and passengers like smaller aircraft. That should have come out in the marketing, shouldn't it? Somebody should have gone back to Airbus and said, now wait a minute. I'm getting a lot of pushback by passengers who say they don't want to fly in an aircraft that has 835 passengers because can you imagine waiting for your luggage? Which has always been a big problem in the airlines. So if you're going to land an aircraft that has 200 people in it, that's usually 400 or more pieces of luggage. But now you have up to 835. They never made the interior of an A380 that would hold 835. 600, yes, but they never went to the maximum they could have gone to, which would have involved having the same seats in the first class as they had in coach. In other words, it would have been an all-coach aircraft in order to fly 835s. Okay, so now the routes in marketing in and around the world actually call for more medium-sized aircraft. That's why 787 has been so tremendously successful. Has literally become, something sad. Too bad. I don't like to see anything in aviation fail, but that sure did. So the last item here is remember the Concorde. Most of you don't probably remember the Concorde. It was built by the British and French, by the same kind of consortium that's now building Airbus. They built it because they wanted to, because they thought it would be kind of neat to have a supersonic transport go from England to New York. What they failed to realize is that most countries will not allow the Concorde to overfly the country because of the sonic boom is so terrible. So the best they could do was to go from London to New York, or from London to Cairo, or someplace like that where they could be mostly out over the oceans. The Concorde was a disaster almost from the minute it started flying. You had to pay like $10,000 for a one-way trip from London to New York. Pardon? Because it cost a tremendous amount of money to fly that aircraft. They were trying to make some kind of money. Eric? No, there are no more Concordes flying. There are some Concordes on display. One up in Boeing in Washington area. It's called Boeing Field. They have a Concorde there. And they have Concordes, several others around the country. And they have them obviously in Europe. And they're all on display. It is something that will obviously never fly again. But it was horrendously expensive to operate it. It gulped fuel like nothing they ever saw before. But you could take off from London. You could be in New York before you left London, time-wise. Leave London at 8 o'clock in the morning and be in New York at 6 o'clock in the morning because it went faster than the sun. So you could actually watch the sunrise from the west. If you took off just after sunset from London, you could actually see the sun rising in the west. So the point here is that nobody went back and remembered the Concorde when they decided to do the A380. If somebody had remembered that, they should have said, well, wait a minute now. Maybe we should rethink this thing. So that's the end of the lecture. Are there any questions before we go into the computer lab? Hold on. Hey, quiet. Jacob? Oh, yeah, take a 10-minute break if you want to. Go ahead.